In the unforgiving winter of 1888, a lone cowboy, Jedediah Stone, makes a choice that will seal his fate. He gives his last threadbare blanket to a stranger freezing in the snow, an act of kindness in a world that rarely rewards it. But when he wakes up, the stranger is gone. Instead, Jed finds himself surrounded by the stoic warriors of a feared Apache tribe, their faces illuminated by the crackling flames of a chief's campfire. Was his act of mercy a fatal mistake? This is the story of a simple choice, a debt of honor, and a stunning twist of fate that proves that even in the harshest wilderness, the deepest secrets are those hidden within the human heart. The wind was a razor across the plains of the Arizona Territory, a relentless force that carried the bite of the high country snow. Jedediah Stone, a man whose face was a road map of long miles and hard sun, pulled the collar of his worn sheepskin coat tighter around his neck. His horse, a sturdy Mustang named Patches, snorted a plume of white into the frigid air, its body heat a small comfort against the encroaching dusk. For 3 days, Jedediah had been tracking a ghost, a phantom cougar that had been preying on the livestock of the small, scattered ranches that clung to the edge of the wilderness. He was a man who made his living on the fringes, a hunter and tracker for hire, his skills honed by a lifetime spent in the unforgiving embrace of the West. But this winter was different. It was a hungrier, more vicious season one that seemed to gnaw at the very bones of the land. He had lost the cougar's trail 2 days ago in a sudden, blinding blizzard. Now he was simply trying to survive, to find a sheltered spot to wait out the night. The landscape was a monochromatic expanse of white and gray, the skeletal arms of mesquite and cholla cactus reaching up from the snow like drowning men. It was in this desolate setting that he saw it, a smudge of darkness against the snow, a shape that didn't belong. He urged Patches forward, his hand resting on the stock of the Winchester rifle, nestled in its scabbard. In these parts, an unexpected encounter was more likely to end in bloodshed than in friendly conversation. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a human form, huddled at the base of a small rocky outcrop. The person was wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket, their body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. Jedediah dismounted his boots, sinking into the deep snow. "Hello there," he called out, his voice rough from the cold. There was no response, only a weak moan that was nearly swallowed by the wind. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of a trap. He'd heard stories of outlaws using a decoy to lure in unsuspecting travelers, but there was nothing, only the vast, empty wilderness. He knelt beside the figure, his heart sinking at what he saw. It was a young man, no older than 20, his face pale and gaunt, his lips a deep, alarming shade of blue. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was dressed in little more than a thin shirt and trousers, clothes utterly inadequate for the brutal cold. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He unstrapped his bedroll from the back of his saddle and pulled out his own thick woolen blanket, his only one. It was a precious commodity in this weather, the difference between a cold night and a frozen death. He carefully wrapped it around the stranger, tucking it in tightly. He built a small fire in the meager shelter of the rocks, using the last of his dry kindling. The flames were a fragile dance of light and warmth in the encroaching darkness. He managed to get a little warm broth from his supplies into the young man, who seemed to rally slightly, his shivering lessening to a more controlled tremor. The stranger's eyes flickered open, dark and surprisingly intense. He tried to speak, but his voice was a hoarse whisper. "Thank you," He managed his gaze, locking onto Jedediah's. "Don't talk." Jedediah said, his voice softer now. "Save your strength." He spent the night tending the fire, his own body aching with the cold that seeped through his coat. He watched the young man, a strange sense of protectiveness settling over him. He had seen too much death in his life, too many good men lost to the harshness of this land. He would not let this one be another casualty. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of grey and pink, Jedediah felt a bone-deep exhaustion settle over him. He had not slept his vigil, kept alive by coffee and sheer willpower. The young man was sleeping peacefully now, his breathing even and steady. Jedediah allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment, the warmth of the rising sun, a welcome caress on his face. When he opened them again, something was wrong. The young man was gone. His blanket was neatly folded where the stranger had been lying, but of the man himself there was no trace. Jedediah stood up, his heart pounding a sudden frantic rhythm. He scanned the snow-covered landscape. There were no tracks. It was as if the man had simply vanished into thin air. A cold dread colder than the winter air washed over him. He had been a fool. He had let his guard down. And now what? Had he been robbed? He quickly checked his saddlebags. Everything was there, his meager supplies, his ammunition, the small pouch of coins he had earned from his last job. He was about to mount Patches and ride on to put this strange encounter behind him when he heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible crunch of so behind him. He spun around, his hand instinctively going for his Colt peacemaker. He froze. He was surrounded. At least a dozen men stood in a silent, menacing circle around his small camp. They were Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their eyes hard and unreadable. They held rifles and bows, their presence a stark and terrifying contrast to the peaceful dawn. In the center of the circle, standing a few feet from the fire, was a man who could only be their chief. He was older than the others, his face a mask of stern authority, his long grey hair braided with eagle feathers. He wore a magnificent war bonnet, its feathers trailing down his back. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He had stumbled into the heart of a war party. He knew the reputation of the Apache fierce, unforgiving warriors who had been fighting a desperate, bloody war against the encroaching tide of white settlers. He had heard the stories, the tales of torture and death that followed in their wake. The chief took a step forward, his eyes as dark and piercing as a hawk's, fixed on Jedediah. He said nothing, his silence more unnerving than any threat. Jedediah's mind raced. He had no chance against so many. He could try to fight, but it would be a futile, bloody end. He slowly raised his hands, a universal sign of surrender. "I mean you no harm," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear that threatened to consume him. The chief's expression did not change. He gestured to two of his warriors, who moved forward and took Jedediah's weapons. They were rough but efficient, their movements practiced and sure. Jedediah's heart sank. This was it. This was how his story would end, a nameless victim in a forgotten corner of the wilderness. He thought of his sister Sarah back in Missouri, the only family he had left. He had promised her he would be careful that he would come home one day. The chief spoke, his voice a low, guttural sound that seemed to resonate in the still morning air. He spoke in the Apache tongue, a language Jedediah did not understand, but the meaning was clear. He was a prisoner. He was led away from his camp, his horse and supplies left behind. He was marched through the snow, his captors silent and watchful. He had no idea where they were taking him or what they intended to do with him. He only knew that he was walking towards his death. The journey was a blur of snow and trees, of cold and fear. He lost track of time, his world shrinking to the crunch of his boots in the snow and the stoic faces of his captors. He was a man who had always been in control of his own destiny, a man who had prided himself on his self-reliance. Now he was utterly helpless, his life in the hands of men who had every reason to hate him. Finally, they arrived at a large hidden camp nestled in a narrow canyon. It was a bustling community, with dozens of wickiups, the traditional Apache dwellings, scattered among the rocks and trees. Women and children stopped to stare as he was led through the camp, their faces a mixture of curiosity and hostility. He was taken to the center of the camp, where a large fire burned in a circular pit. The chief, who he now understood, was the legendary Geronimo, a name that struck fear into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike, gestured for him to sit. Jedediah obeyed, his mind numb, with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He was sitting in the campfire circle of Geronimo, the most feared Apache leader in the territory. This was a place few white men had ever seen and lived to tell the tale. The warriors who had captured him formed a circle around the fire, their faces grim and unyielding. Geronimo sat opposite him, his eyes never leaving Jedediah's. The chief began to speak, his voice slow and deliberate, his words translated by a younger Apache who spoke broken but understandable English. "You are a white man," the translator said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You are our enemy." Jedediah swallowed hard. "I am not your enemy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I am just a hunter." Geronimo spoke again, a long, impassioned speech that seemed to fill the canyon with its power. The translator struggled to keep up his words, coming in short, clipped sentences. "He says you are all the same," the translator said. "You come to our land, you take our water, you kill our game, you drive us from our homes." "I have done none of those things," Jedediah protested, his voice gaining a little strength. "I have always respected your ways. I have always tried to live in peace." Geronimo's eyes narrowed. He said something sharp and dismissive. "He says you lie," the translator said. "All white men lie." Jedediah felt a surge of anger, a desperate, defiant spark in the face of his impending doom. "I do not lie," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I am an honest man." Geronimo seemed to consider his words, his gaze unwavering. He then said something that made the other warriors murmur among themselves. "He asks you a question," the translator said, his voice holding a new note of interest. "He asks you, where did you get the blanket?" Jedediah was taken aback. "The blanket? Of all the things to ask, why that?" "It was my blanket," he said, confused. "I gave it to a young man I found in the snow. He was freezing to death." Geronimo listened intently, his expression unreadable. He then spoke a single word, a word that Jedediah did not understand, but that seemed to carry a great weight. The translator's eyes widened in surprise. He looked at Jedediah, then back at Geronimo, as if he could not believe what he was hearing. He says the young man you saved was his son." The words hung in the air, a stunning, unbelievable revelation. Jedediah stared at Geronimo, his mind reeling. The young man, the stranger in the snow, was the son of the most feared Apache chief in the territory. He had, in a single act of kindness, saved the life of the one person who could either save him or condemn him to a brutal death. The world, which had seemed so bleak and merciless just moments before, had suddenly inexplicably shifted on its axis. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was something else, something he could not yet comprehend. He was a man who had, without knowing it, stepped into the heart of a family's drama, a drama that would decide his fate. The revelation that the half-frozen stranger was Geronimo's son, whose name was Nardayol, hung in the frigid air as thick and palpable as the smoke from the central fire. Jedediah's mind, which had been preparing for a swift and brutal end, now scrambled to catch up with this new, bewildering reality. The circle of warriors who had been a monolith of silent hostility now shifted their gaze as a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and a grudging respect that Jedediah could feel but not yet understand. Geronimo's stern visage remained, but a new light flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. He spoke again, his voice a low rumble, and the translator, a young warrior named Taza, relayed the words. "The chief says his son Nardayol returned to camp at dawn. He told of a white man who showed him mercy. He said you gave him your own blanket, your own fire, your own food when you had little for yourself." Jedediah could only nod his throat too tight for words. He remembered the young man's intense gaze, the whispered "thank you." He had dismissed it as the delirium of a dying man. Now it was the cornerstone of his survival. Nardayol was on a vision quest. Taza continued, his English still clipped but imbued with a new gravity. A test of his spirit. He was to endure the storm alone to find his strength, but the storm was too strong. He was shamed to be found so weak. Jedediah finally found his voice. He wasn't weak. He was unprepared. No man could have survived that night without shelter and proper gear. It was a test of survival, not shame. His words, meant as a simple statement of fact, seemed to resonate with Geronimo. The chief's eyes, which had been fixed on Jedediah with an unnerving intensity, now softened almost imperceptibly. He spoke a few words to Taza, his tone carrying a note of contemplation. "The chief says you speak with a straight tongue," Taza translated. "He says few white men would see honor in an Apache's struggle." A woman emerged from one of the larger wiki-ups, her face etched with worry. She carried a bowl of steaming broth and approached the fire circle. The warriors parted to let her pass. She knelt before Geronimo, speaking to him in a low, urgent voice. It was clear she was his wife, Nardayol's mother. Her name was Ishke. Her gaze fell upon Jedediah, and for a moment he saw not the wife of a feared war chief, but the universal anxiety of a mother for her child. Geronimo gestured for Jedediah to take the bowl. "You will eat," Taza said, a simple command that felt like a monumental reprieve. The broth was rich and savory, made from venison and wild herbs. It warmed him from the inside out, chasing away the last of the night's chill and the icy tendrils of fear. As he ate, a discussion began among the warriors. Their voices were low and guttural, a complex tapestry of sounds that Jedediah could not decipher. But he could read the tones, the shifting dynamics of the conversation. Some of the warriors were still hostile, their gestures sharp and dismissive. They pointed at Jedediah, their faces contorted with a deep-seated hatred. He recognized one of them from the wanted posters in the town of Tombstone, a warrior named Kai-Ita, known for his ferocity and his utter contempt for the white man. Kai-Ita spoke, his voice a harsh rasp. He spat on the ground near Jedediah's feet, his meaning clear, even without a translation. Taza, however, provided one anyway. "Kai-Ita says you are still a snake. He says one act of kindness does not wash away the blood of our people. He says you should be killed, your head placed on a pole as a warning to all other white eyes. The threat hung in the air, a stark reminder of his precarious position. But Geronimo raised a hand, and the camp fell silent. He spoke again, his voice calm but absolute, a tone that commanded unquestioning obedience. "The chief says you are under his protection." Taza translated his own voice, now holding a note of awe. "He says a debt of honor has been created. His son lives because of you. Therefore you will live." The relief that washed over Jedediah was so profound it almost buckled him. But it was a fragile relief, a temporary stay of execution in a place where death was a constant companion. He was alive, but he was still a prisoner. He was given a small empty wickiup to use as his own, a space that offered privacy, but little comfort. The warriors watched his every move, their suspicion a constant, palpable presence. He was not bound, but he was a captive nonetheless, a hawk with clipped wings in a cage of rock and snow. Days turned into a week. Jedediah fell into a strange routine, a life suspended between two worlds. He was given chores, mending, tack-chopping wood tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on his uncertain future. He learned the rhythms of the Apache camp, the morning prayers to the rising sun, the evening stories told around the fire. He saw Nadayole from a distance. The young man was recovering his strength, returning. He would sometimes catch Jedediah's eye, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a shared secret in a world of open hostility. Jedediah learned more about the Apache, not from books or prejudiced tales, but from direct observation. He saw their deep connection to the land, their reverence for the natural world. He saw the love and laughter within their families, the fierce loyalty that bound them together. He began to understand that they were not the savage caricatures of popular imagination, but a proud and ancient people fighting a desperate battle for their very existence. But the undercurrent of tension never fully dissipated. Kai-Ita and his faction of warriors remained a constant threat. They saw Jedediah's presence as a weakness, a betrayal of their cause. They would taunt him, their words like poisoned darts, their eyes filled with a burning hatred. One afternoon, as Jedediah was sharpening a hunting knife, Kai-Ita approached him, his shadow falling over Jedediah's work. "You think you are one of us now, white man?" Kai-Ita sneered his English, surprisingly fluent, learned Jedediah, suspected during a stint in a government-run prison. "I think I am a man who is trying to survive," Jedediah replied, his voice, even his gaze, steady. "You will not survive." Kai-Ita said, his voice a low hiss. "The chief is old. His heart has been softened by his son's weakness. But there are others younger, stronger, who see the truth. You are a cancer in this camp, and we will cut you out." The threat was clear, the promise of violence hanging in the air. Jedediah knew that Geronimo's protection was not absolute. A single misstep, a single moment of weakness could be his undoing. The first major twist came not from the threat of violence, but from a source Jedediah could never have anticipated. A few days later, a scout returned to camp. His horse lathered and breathing hard. He brought news that sent a ripple of alarm through the community. A detachment of U.S. cavalry, led by a notoriously ruthless captain named Marcus Thorne, was sweeping the territory conducting a winter campaign to round up the renegade Apache and force them onto the reservation at San Carlos, a place the Apache called Hell's 40 Acres. The news was a death knell for the camp's fragile peace. The Apache knew that a winter campaign was a war of annihilation, a brutal strategy designed to catch them when they were at their most vulnerable, their food supplies low, their movements hampered by the snow. Jedediah's heart sank. He knew of Captain Thorn, a man who saw the Apache not as people, but as vermin to be exterminated. Thorn was a zealot, a man who believed in the manifest destiny of the white race with a terrifying, unshakable conviction. The camp was thrown into a frenzy of activity. The women began to pack their meager belongings, the warriors prepared for battle. The air crackled with a new, more urgent tension. That evening, Geronimo summoned Jedediah to his wickiup. The chief's face was grim, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. Nadayol was there, along with Taza and a few of the other senior warriors. "The soldiers are coming," Taza said, his voice tight with worry. "They are many, and they are well armed." Geronimo spoke, his voice a low, somber tone. "The chief says we must move. We must flee into the mountains, where the soldiers cannot follow. But it will be a hard journey, especially for the women and children." He then looked directly at Jedediah, his gaze piercing and direct. "He says you know the ways of the white soldiers. You know how they think, how they fight." Jedediah's blood ran cold. He knew what was coming. "He wants you to help us," Taza said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "He wants you to guide us, to use your knowledge to keep us safe." The request was a stunning, impossible choice. To help the Apache would be to betray his own people, to become a traitor in the eyes of the law. If he was caught, he would be hanged without a trial. But to refuse would be to condemn these people. These families he had come to know to a brutal, almost certain death at the hands of Captain Thorn. He thought of Ishke's worried face, of the children playing in the snow, their laughter a fragile sound in a world that was about to be torn apart. He was trapped, caught in a moral vice that threatened to crush him. He was a lone cowboy, a man who had always lived by his own code of honor. But what did that code mean now in a world where right and wrong were so hopelessly, tragically entangled? He looked at Geronimo, at the weight of a people's survival etched on his face. He looked at Nadayol, the young man whose life he had saved, and whose fate was now intertwined with his own. His decision, when it came, was not a choice between two sides, but a choice between two kinds of death, a death of the body, or a death of the soul. "I will help you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but a whisper that would echo through the canyons and change the course of his life forever. He had given a stranger his last blanket. Now he was giving a people his last hope. The lone cowboy was no longer alone. He was a part of their story now, a story that was hurtling towards a violent, uncertain climax. Jedediah's acceptance of the role of guide sent a seismic shock through the Apache camp. To some, like Nadayol and Taza, it was a sign of hope, a validation of the chief's faith. To others, particularly Keita and his followers, it was an act of profound betrayal, an unforgivable alliance with the enemy. The tension in the camp, already at a breaking point, now became a tightly wound spring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The first test of Jedediah's new role came immediately. The Apache were preparing to flee, to scatter into the labyrinthine canyons of the Sierra Madre, a place where they had always found refuge. But Jedediah knew that Captain Thorn would be expecting this. Thorn was a student of Apache tactics, and he would have the traditional escape routes covered. "We can't just run," Jedediah said, speaking to Geronimo and the War Council, his words translated by a now ever-present Taza. Thorn will have his scouts watching every pass, every canyon. He'll be waiting for us." Cir scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "The white man thinks he knows our land better than we do. We have hidden in these mountains for generations. The soldiers are fools. They will never find us." "Thorn is not a fool," Jedediah countered, his voice firm. "He's a wolf and he's hungry. He'll be methodical. He'll set up a perimeter and slowly tighten the noose. We'll be trapped with no food and no escape." His words, born of a grim understanding of military strategy, seemed to strike a chord with Geronimo. The chief, who had been listening with a deep, thoughtful silence, now posed a question. "The chief asks, 'What is your plan?'" Taza translated. Jedediah took a deep breath. "We do the one thing he won't expect. We don't run. We hide. Right under his nose." He pointed to a map he had drawn in the dirt, a crude but accurate representation of the surrounding territory. "There's a place," he said, "a canyon known to the old prospectors as Whispering Gorge. It's a box canyon with only one way in and one way out. It's considered a death trap. No one would ever think to look for us there." "A death trap," Cir sneered. "You would lead us to our graves." "The entrance is narrow, easily defended." Jedediah explained, his voice gaining in confidence. "And inside the canyon widens into a series of smaller hidden caves and grottos. There's a spring and enough game to last us for weeks if we're careful. The soldiers will ride right past it. They'll be looking for a trail leading into the mountains, not a dead end." It was a gamble, a desperate, audacious plan that went against every instinct of Apache warfare, which was based on mobility and evasion. But Geronimo, after a long, silent contemplation, saw the wisdom in its audacity. He gave the order. They would go to Whispering Gorge. The journey was a tense, silent affair, a ghost-like procession through the snow-covered landscape. Jedediah led the way, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. He chose a route that was difficult and treacherous, but one that was unlikely to be patrolled by Thorn's scouts. They traveled at night, their movements masked by the darkness and the falling snow. They reached the entrance to Whispering Gorge just as the first light of dawn was breaking. It was as Jedediah had described it, a narrow, almost invisible cleft in the rock face, a place that would be easily overlooked by a passing patrol. The Apache, their initial skepticism replaced by a grudging admiration, filed into the canyon. The women and children were quickly settled into the hidden caves, their presence masked from the outside world. The warriors under Jedediah's direction set up a series of well-concealed defensive positions, turning the death trap into a formidable fortress. For a few days, a tense peace settled over the canyon. They were hidden, they were safe, but they were still prisoners of the winter and the ever-present threat of discovery. The waiting was a nerve-wracking ordeal, a slow, agonizing test of their resolve. The second major twist of the story arrived with a sudden, terrifying swiftness. A young Apache boy, no older than 10, who had been playing near the canyon entrance, stumbled and fell, his cry of pain echoing in the still air. It was a small, seemingly insignificant event, but it had catastrophic consequences. A patrol of cavalry troopers who had been riding nearby heard the cry. They dismounted their carbines at the ready and began to investigate. Jedediah, who had been inspecting the defensive positions, saw them coming. His heart leaped into his throat. They were a small group, only 4 men, but they were enough to raise the alarm. "Hold your fire," he hissed to the warriors, hidden in the rocks above. "Don't let them see you." The soldiers approached the canyon entrance. Their curiosity piqued. They were just a few yards away from discovering the Apache's hiding place. Jedediah knew that if they saw the tracks, the signs of a large group of people, the entire camp would be doomed. He had to act, and he had to act now. In a split-second decision, he stepped out from behind the rocks, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Don't shoot," he called out, his voice calm and steady. "I'm unarmed." The soldiers, startled by his sudden appearance, raised their carbines. "Who are you?" their sergeant, a hard-faced man named O'Malley, demanded. "What are you doing out here?" "My name is Jedediah Stone," he said, his mind racing to concoct a plausible story. "I'm a prospector. My mule broke its leg a few days ago. I've been holed up in this canyon trying to wait out the storm." O'Malley eyed him with suspicion. "A prospector? In this weather, that's a fool's game." "I'm a stubborn man," Jedediah said with a wry smile. "We heard a cry," another soldier said. "Sounded like a boy." "That was me," Jedediah lied smoothly. "I slipped on the ice, twisted my ankle." He winced, feigning a pain he did not feel. O'Malley seemed to relax slightly, but his suspicion did not entirely dissipate. He gestured to one of his men. "Check out the canyon. Make sure he's alone." Jedediah's heart pounded against his ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. If the soldier went too far, he would see the signs of the camp. But as the soldier was about to enter the canyon, a new voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the air. "Sergeant O'Malley, what is the meaning of this delay?" Captain Thorne, astride a magnificent black stallion, had arrived. He was a man who radiated an aura of cold, ruthless authority. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were devoid of any warmth or compassion. "Captain," O'Malley said, saluting smartly, "we found this man a prospector. Says he's been holed up in the canyon." Thorne's gaze fell upon Jedediah, and for a moment Jedediah felt as if his soul was being laid bare. Thorne was a man who saw the world in black and white, and Jedediah was now firmly in the grey area in between. "A prospector," Thorne said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or a sympathizer, an Apache lover." The accusation hung in the air, a direct challenge to Jedediah's carefully constructed lie. "I'm just a man trying to survive, Captain," Jedediah said, his voice steady. Thorne dismounted, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked slowly around Jedediah, his eyes taking in every detail of his appearance. "You're a long way from any known prospecting sites, Mr. Stone," Thorne said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "And you seem remarkably well fed for a man who has been stranded in a blizzard." Jedediah's mind raced. He had to give Thorne a reason to believe him, a reason to leave. "I got lucky," he said. "Found a deer that had been killed by a cougar. I've been living off that." Thorne's eyes narrowed. He was not a man who believed in luck. He was a man who believed in order, in control, in the absolute, unshakable righteousness of his cause. He was about to press his interrogation further, when a new sound, a sound that made Jedediah's blood run cold, echoed through the canyon. It was the sound of a baby crying. The sound, though faint, was unmistakable. It came from one of the hidden caves, a sound of life that was about to become a death sentence. Thorne's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the canyon entrance. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "So," he said, his voice soft but triumphant, "the prospector has a family." He knew. The game was up. The lie had crumbled. "Sergeant," Thorne commanded, his voice now a whip crack of authority, "take this man into custody, and then I want this canyon scoured. Every man, woman, and child, I want them all, alive if possible, but I want them." The soldiers moved to seize Jedediah, but before they could reach him, a new terrifying sound filled the air. It was the Apache war cry. From the rocks above, a volley of arrows rained down on the soldiers. One of them, the man who had been about to enter the canyon, fell to the ground, an arrow protruding from his chest. The firefight was sudden, brutal, and chaotic. The soldiers, caught by surprise, scrambled for cover. Jedediah, in the midst of the chaos, was thrown to the ground. He saw Campfire, his face a mask of fury, leading a charge of warriors from a hidden position. They descended upon the remaining soldiers with a savage, desperate intensity. Jedediah knew he had to do something. He couldn't let Thorn escape. If the captain got back to his main force, he would return with overwhelming numbers, and the Apache would be massacred. He saw Thorn, who had taken cover behind his horse, reloading his pistol. Jedediah, acting on pure instinct, lunged for the fallen soldier's carbine. He was not a soldier. He was a hunter. But he knew how to shoot. He took aim, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was true. Thorn cried out in pain, clutching his shoulder. His pistol fell from his hand. Campfire and his warriors were upon him in an instant. They disarmed him, their faces a mixture of triumph and hatred. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining soldiers their leader captured surrendered. Jedediah stood up, his body trembling with the aftershock of the violence. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had fired on a U.S. Army officer. He was no longer just a sympathizer. He was a renegade, an outlaw, a man with a price on his head. Geronimo and the other Apache emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. They now had a new problem, a new dangerous complication. They had a captive, a high-ranking, vindictive, and very valuable U.S. Army captain. And they had a white man who had just saved them, a man who was now one of them, whether he wanted to be or not. The lone cowboy's choice had led him to a place he could never have imagined, a place of violence and honor, of betrayal and loyalty. He was no longer a man on the fringes. He was at the very heart of the conflict, a conflict that was about to enter its most dangerous and unpredictable phase. The ghost of the canyon had been revealed, and the world would never be the same for Jedediah Stone. The aftermath of the brief, brutal firefight left Whispering Gorge in a state of suspended shock. The echoes of gunfire had been replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the mournful cry of the winter wind. Jedediah stood over the body of the soldier he had indirectly caused to be killed, the carbine still warm in his hands. The weight of his actions settled upon him a physical burden that seemed to press him into the blood-stained snow. He was no longer a bystander, no longer a man caught between two worlds. He had chosen his side, and the choice was irrevocable. Captain Thorn, his arm bound in a makeshift sling, was dragged before Geronimo. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost incandescent. Even as a captive, he exuded an aura of arrogant defiance. "You will hang for this, all of you." Thorn spat, his voice laced with venom. "I will see you and your savage whelps wiped from the face of the earth." Geronimo, his face impassive, listened to Tarza's translation without a flicker of emotion. He then spoke, his voice low and measured. "The chief says you are the one who brings the war to our homes," Tarza relayed. "You are the one who hunts our women and children like animals. You are the one who has forfeited his right to mercy. The air crackled with a deadly tension. Jedediah knew what was coming. The Apache code of justice was swift and unforgiving. Thorn had been captured in battle. His fate was sealed. But as the warriors moved to carry out the sentence, a new voice, a voice that surprised even Jedediah, spoke out. It was Nadayol. "Father," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Do not kill him." Geronimo turned to his son, his expression a mixture of surprise and stern inquiry. "He is a soldier." Nadayole continued, his gaze meeting his father's. "He fights for his people, just as we fight for ours. To kill him now, as a helpless captive, would be an act of dishonor. It would make us no better than him." The words, spoken with a wisdom that belied his youth, seemed to resonate with the old chief. He had seen his son's brush with death, had seen the mercy of a stranger save him. That experience had changed Nadayole, had forged a new kind of strength in him, a strength that was not just of the body, but of the spirit. But Keita, his face a thundercloud of rage, would not be swayed. "He is a butcher," he roared. "He has killed our brothers, our sisters. He deserves to die 1,000 deaths." A heated debate erupted among the warriors, a clash between the old ways of vengeance and a new emerging sense of honor. It was a conflict that mirrored the one raging within Jedediah's own soul. In the end, it was Geronimo who made the decision. Thorn would be kept alive, a prisoner, a bargaining chip in the desperate game of survival they were now playing. The days that followed were a tense, uneasy truce. Thorn was kept under heavy guard, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the larger war that raged beyond the canyon walls. He was a cancer in their midst, his venomous whispers and defiant glares sowing seeds of dissent among the more impressionable young warriors. Jedediah, meanwhile, found himself in a new, more complex role. He was no longer just a guide, but a trusted advisor, his knowledge of the white man's world now a vital asset. He helped the Apache organize their defenses, ration their supplies, and tend to their wounded. He found a strange sense of purpose in his new life, a sense of belonging he had not known since he had left his family home in Missouri. He grew closer to Nadayole, a bond of mutual respect and friendship forging between them. He saw in the young man a reflection of his own younger self, a yearning for a world where honor and integrity still mattered. But the peace was a fragile one, and it was shattered by a new, more insidious threat. A sickness began to spread through the camp, a fever that left its victims weak and delirious. It was a disease of the white man, a sickness to which the Apache had no immunity. The first to fall was one of the children, a little girl with bright, curious eyes. Her death sent a wave of grief and fear through the camp. The medicine man's traditional remedies were powerless against this new invisible enemy. The sickness spread quickly, claiming more victims, young and old. The canyon, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Jedediah. His heart, heavy with a sense of helpless responsibility, knew he had to do something. He remembered seeing a small, abandoned mission a few days' ride from the canyon. It had been run by a Spanish priest, a man who was known for his knowledge of herbs and medicine. "There might be medicine at the old mission," he told Geronimo. "Quinine for the fever. It's a long shot, but it's our only chance." Geronimo, his own wife, now among the sick, agreed. It was a desperate gamble, but they had no other choice. Jedediah prepared for the journey, a perilous ride through hostile territory. He would be traveling alone, a single man, against a world that wanted him dead. As he was about to leave, Nadayole approached him. "I am coming with you," he said, his voice firm. "No," Jedediah said. "It's too dangerous. Your people need you here." "You are my brother." Nardayol set his hand resting on Jedediah's shoulder. "I will not let you ride alone." And so the two men, the lone cowboy and the chief's son, set out on their desperate quest, their fates now inextricably linked. The journey was a harrowing one. They traveled by night, their horses picking their way through the treacherous snow-covered terrain. They narrowly avoided a cavalry patrol, their hearts pounding as the soldiers rode past, their voices a low murmur in the darkness. They reached the mission on the third day, a crumbling adobe structure that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The place was deserted, the priest long gone. But in a small locked chest in the infirmary, they found what they were looking for: a small supply of quinine, a precious, life-saving powder. Their journey back was even more perilous. A blizzard descended upon them, a blinding whiteout that turned the world into a disorienting swirl of snow and wind. They became lost, their sense of direction gone, their bodies numb with cold. It was in this moment of despair that the final, most stunning twist of the story unfolded. They stumbled upon a small, hidden cave, a refuge from the storm. As they huddled inside, trying to coax a small fire to life, they heard a sound from the back of the cave, a low, guttural moan. They drew their weapons, their eyes straining to see into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man who was gaunt and emaciated, his clothes in tatters. It was Captain Thorne. He had escaped. How they did not know. But he was here in this cave, as lost and desperate as they were. Thorne's eyes widened in disbelief when he saw them. He was weak, starving on the verge of death. The arrogant, defiant captain was gone, replaced by a broken, pathetic shell of a man. Jedediah and Nardayol were faced with a choice that would define the very essence of their character. They could leave him to die a just and fitting end for a man who had brought so much suffering to their people. Or they could show him the same mercy that Jedediah had once shown to Nardayol, the same compassion that had set this entire incredible series of events in motion. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They were not butchers. They were not murderers. They were men of honor. They shared their meager supplies with Thorne, gave him the last of their food, wrapped him in their own blankets. They saved his life, just as Jedediah had saved Nardayol's. When the blizzard finally broke, they took Thorne with them, not as a prisoner, but as a fellow survivor. The journey back to the canyon was a strange, silent one, a journey of three men who had been forged in the crucible of the wilderness, their old enmities burned away by the shared experience of survival. They returned to the camp to find that the sickness had begun to recede. The quinine had worked. The fever had broken. The camp, which had been on the verge of despair, was now filled with a sense of hope, of renewal. Thorne, his strength slowly returning, was a changed man. He had seen the depths of his own mortality, had been saved by the very people he had vowed to destroy. He said nothing, but his eyes held a new, humbled understanding. A few days later, he was gone. He left in the middle of the night, leaving behind a small handwritten note. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," it said. "I will not forget." The final chapter of Jedediah's story was not one of violence or vengeance, but of a quiet, unexpected peace. The winter campaign eventually ended, the soldiers withdrawing from the territory. The Apache, their strength renewed, their spirit unbroken, remained free in their mountain sanctuary. Jedediah Stone, the lone cowboy, never returned to the white man's world. He had found his home, his family, his purpose in the heart of the Apache Nation. He had given a stranger his last blanket, and in return he had found his own soul. He had learned that the greatest treasures are not found in the ground, but in the depths of the human heart, and that the truest measure of a man is not in the battles he wins, but in the mercy he shows to his enemies. The lone cowboy was alone, no more. He was a part of the legend of the West, a story whispered around campfires, a testament to the enduring power of compassion in a world that so often seemed to have none. And so the story of Jedediah Stone comes to a close, a story that began with a single act of kindness in the face of a brutal winter, and ended with a peace that was more valuable than any gold. It's a powerful reminder that our choices, no matter how small they may seem, can have a profound and lasting impact on the world around us. It's a story of honor, of redemption, and of the surprising, unbreakable bonds that can form between the most unlikely of allies. What did you think of Jedediah's journey? What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story as moving and thought-provoking as we did, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the heart of the American West. Thank you for watching.